Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Torah study for a Shabbos morning, joined this morning by my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida. Marc, good morning.
Good morning, my friend.
Good. We're missing Rabbi Hirsch this morning. She's still with her family, and we wish her very, very well and hope that she'll be with us next week. This morning, we are in the middle of a four-part series in the beginning of the book of Exodus, which is talking about the Pesach story, the story of our liberation. And this morning's Torah portion is a very interesting study because it is sort of like the second act of a play. This is where the plot gets complicated. Last week, we opened the book of Exodus and saw our enslavement by Pharaoh, the rise of Moses, the arrival of Moses, Moses' first demand to Pharaoh, let my people go. That's the sort of beginning of the movie. It's the beginning of the play. It's the opening of the drama that brings us in. This is the part where the drama gets complicated. Or to put it in a slightly different metaphor, as an artist begins to create a piece, the artist begins with some idea about what he or she wants to create. And then what happens in the process, the creative process, is that the material pushes back. The sculptor has to figure out how to use this piece of stone. The painter has to figure out how to make the design come to life, how to translate what is inside my head and inside my heart to what I want to put out for the whole world. The writer, Marc, you're a wonderful, wonderful writer. There's that moment in the writing process when the words just don't line up on the page the way they were supposed to, or you just can't figure out that particular quirk of the plot, or you just can't get through. There's this place where the material that we're working with pushes back. And this is the place we are in the drama of Moses and the liberation of the people of Israel. Pharaoh says no. Pharaoh says, I don't know you. I don't know what you want from me. You're just slaves. Pharaoh, in a certain way, Pharaoh presents a very interesting character. He can't imagine the idea that slaves would be liberated because slaves are slaves. And he can't imagine that a representative of a community of slaves would come before him and demand their liberation in the name of some God he's never heard of, a God who is invisible, a God who's not represented by a statue or an image. The whole thing is beyond his imagination. And Pharaoh gets hard. And the story of the hardening of Pharaoh, of course, is part of the drama here. And then he goes to the people of Israel. And the people of Israel, they're just as hard. They're going to say to him, why the hell did you do this to us? You've now made it more difficult. Just as an analogy, as a parallel, Martin Luther King, whose birthday we celebrated last week, he gets put into the jail of Birmingham during the Birmingham bus boycotts. And there's the famous letter that he writes, actually wrote it on toilet paper in the jail. The letter from the Birmingham jail is one of the great pieces of American political literature. And the principal audience is not the white establishment. The people that really, really frustrated Martin Luther King were the black ministers of the South, who basically said, brother, why are you doing this? You're making it worse. Shush, still, be quiet, let it go. The ameliorists, the people who said, let the change come slowly, the ones who were ready to just accept their status in the society because they couldn't imagine equality. And here is this young preacher with a movement that is predominantly made up of the young, saying enough is enough, that to wait is to capitulate to the prejudice, the hatred, the discrimination, the injustice of racism in America. Well, that's what happens. And there's this moment when King is losing his faith and he's pushing back. And that's what letters from the Birmingham jail are all about. It's the recovery of his power and his faith. And that's what we're going to see in Moshe Rabbeinu this morning. And that's what God's task is to give him back the spirit to fight back, give him back the urgency of fighting back. And what happens here is a remarkable text. And this morning, we're going to do something we haven't done in a while. We're going to do a very close study of a text. So we're in the 6th chapter of the book of Exodus, and I'm going to put it up here on the screen so we can look at it together. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe. Moses says to, God says to Moshe, Atatira asher asel lefaro. Now you're going to see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh. Now you're going to see what I do. Ki biyad chazaka shlachem biyad chazaka yarshem yaretzo. I'm going to show you my power. Now I'm going to show you my power. In a certain way, this is the revelation. When King pushes back against the discouraging words of his colleagues in the clergy, when the artist pushes back against the material and reestablishes his control over the material, when the idealist says, I'm not going to give up my faith in this process, that's this revelation. That's the God who's being revealed here. Vaydaber Elohim al Moshe. God says to Moshe, V'yomer elav ani Adonai. Here's what you got to know. I'm going to tell you a secret. I'm going to tell you who I am. I'm going to reveal myself to you. All right. And he says, Ve'er Abraham. When I talk to Avram and Yitzchak and Yaakov, to your ancestors, right, I use the name El Shaddai, God of protection. But my personal name, I never told them. That is, there are aspects of divinity which I never revealed to your ancestors because they were never in the position you're in, because they never had to fight back against injustice, because they never met an adversary like Pharaoh, because they never had to face this kind of frustration, the frustration of the artist with a vision, of the ideologue with a vision, of the revolutionary with a vision, and who's meeting the resistance of the world. I never had to reveal myself to you that way, to them that way, because they didn't face what you're facing. But you need this strength. I'm going to give you a dose of divinity that's going to get you through this. V'gam, I'm going to make with you a covenant. Hakemoti et briti itam. I made a covenant with them. And I'm going to show you now how that covenant's going to come to fruition with you. And I want you to know, V'gam shamati et nakat b'nei Yisrael. I have heard, I know the pain of this people. And I know their condition, and I know how broken they are. I know how broken they are, that they're not ready to hear your message of liberation. They're not ready to hear this idea that they can be more than just slaves. They're not ready to take a step out of their psychological slavery, out of their spiritual slavery. So here's what I'm going to do. And now God gives them these promises. Now, we all know these promises because it's presumably the reason there are 4 cups at the Seder table. But as we're going to see in a moment, there's more than 4 promises. So, Marc, it's your turn. Take us through these promises and show us what they do for Moshe Rabbeinu, for Moses, and for the people of Israel, and why it is that at every Seder we repeat them again and again and again.
And thank you. That was really great. Your setup is beautiful. I hope to be worthy of it in my punchline. So here's the deal. The verse, you should tell your child, these existential rabbit hole verses, where all of a sudden we're reading a story and it says, you shall tell your child this because of what God did for me when I left Egypt. You don't have that in Moby Dick. You will remember what you did, what I did chasing the white whale when you were working on the Pequot. No, it doesn't. This is in the Torah. There's these verses which says this isn't a story about old things and old people. This is a story about your own personal liberation and your faith in me, in God, the eternal source of all liberation and joy. That's what it's about. So the brilliance of the Torah, shown here more than in any other part, is that it's simultaneously weaving an intricate story about the liberation from Egypt, while at the same time establishing a prototype, a roadmap, an existential roadmap, a spiritual roadmap for our liberation in every age and in every time. That's what's going on. And the rabbis, my guess is they figured 4 cups of wine is already going to get you shikar enough. If they put down 8, the people would be blotto. They'd be crawling away from the table drunk. So, but there's actually in that verse where they gray out these promises, and each one is a cup of wine, and they debate, is it 4 or 5? And there's this category called teku, which is that certain issues of halacha are so difficult that they are left for Hatishbi, the Eliyahu Hatishbi, the Elijah the prophet. He'll figure it out eventually, whether it's 4 cups or 5 cups, and that's why we put the 5th cup of wine on the table. But in truth, there's actually 8 promises. And in my view, and in my midrash here, they are each archetypes of stages along the way of our personal spiritual liberation. So let's go through them. The first is, Hotzeti etchem, I will bring you out from under the yoke of slavery. Okay, you got that, the Hotzeti?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that first one, the first promise is you need to get out of Egypt to be liberated. God couldn't liberate the people if they were still in Egypt. That's Hotzeti. You need to get out in order to get free. It's simple. But in our liberation, to give you both sides of this beautiful dance of words and thoughts and souls, in our liberations, it means you have to get out of an abusive relationship. You have to get out of a dead-end job. You have to get out of a circle of friends who do drugs or cheat or lie or steal. You have to get out of Egypt. So whatever parts of your life are enslaving you, whatever situation you're in, which is destroying you slowly, you got to get out. That's the first stage of liberation. The second, Hitzalti. I will rescue you from their bondage. So the first step is to get out of Egypt. The second is to get Egypt out of you. You need to get rescued from what kept you in Egypt. If you were in an abusive relationship, it's because you allowed yourself to do that. What was there in your lack of self-image that allowed you to be in this relationship that was so damaging? This means that you need to address the proximate cause of your slavery. It is close and emergency therapy directed at what you think is causing you pain. That's the second stage of liberation. The third promise is V'ga'alti, right? V'ga'alti etchem. I will redeem you. You need to be freed from the fears and brokenness that caused your descent into Egypt. This is a liberation that goes well beyond the proximate cause of your pain. It's not about, I want to get off of drugs or overeating or sex addictions or pornography or whatever it is that you're struggling with. It's beyond that one thing. It's about getting free from the things you fear that you should have no reason to fear. The fourth is V'lakachti etchem li la'am. You need to find a community of salvation. You cannot be freed alone. You can only be freed as a part of a community of spiritual and physical health. And people don't realize in the 12-step programs, which are really now clearly the most effective ways of freeing people from addictions, it's not the 12 steps. It's the fact that you're in a community of spiritual healing when you go through the steps. You're in a room with other people who you don't have to lie to, who have been in the same place you are. A community of spiritual health. That's why we have a minyan. That's the reason we have synagogues, because you can't liberate yourself alone. That's the next, and then the fifth is Va'iti lechem Elohim. You need to connect to the spiritual source of all liberation. You need to see psychological struggles as spiritual struggles. This is a big time deal. And in the 12-step program, they see that. One of the steps of the 12-step program is we acknowledge that we are helpless to heal ourselves except for the help of a power beyond us with God. And when we, and a lot of young rabbis who come to you and come to me for counseling and mentorship, there's an instinct to psychologize the Torah. And in a way, that's what I'm doing here, but it isn't. What I'm doing here is showing you that the Torah is about not psychologizing our struggle for freedom, but spiritualizing it. It's, I am going to be liberated because of the God who wants me to be liberated and is with me in my struggles. That's the Christian amazing grace, who saved a wretch like me. And 6, v'yadatem. You need to know that your struggles are part of a sacred history of liberation, taught by v'yadatem ki ani Adonai Elohim. You'll know that I'm the Lord, your God, who brought you out from under the sufferings of Egypt. That v'yadatem. You need to know that your struggles are a part of a sacred history of liberation, taught by a people who have been chosen to teach it to the world. So all of a sudden, your struggle is not just your struggle to be free and spiritually elevated and flourishing. It's part of a national destiny of the Jewish people. We are chosen not so that we can puff out our chests and say, look, we're better than anyone. That's not it at all. We're chosen to send a message to the world that God wants us to be free. And if we fight freedom, we are fighting slavery and we are fighting against God, unless we choose to fight for liberation. And then 7, you need to know that the journey ends at home. Now, that in the Torah, of course, meant Jerusalem. Eventually, the rabbis and the mystics have expanded it, I think, helpfully, to Yerushalayim Shel Mala and Yerushalayim Shel Mata, the Jerusalem on earth and the Jerusalem that's in heaven. So this is about the fact that your journey doesn't end with death. Your journey ends in the Jerusalem that's above, which means heaven. That your journey goes beyond death. And at that point, your soul understands everything you did that you failed at doing, why you were afraid, and why you didn't have any need to be afraid. And also maybe it preps you for being reborn. We're not sure. And then the 8th one, V'natati lechem morasha, I will give to you an inheritance, which is very good. You're doing your personal liberation. That's very nice. But you have to tell your children something. Remember, you tell your child. This isn't about your liberation alone. This is about the story you need to tell your children so that they can be liberated too. And so that they can teach their children to be liberated. And if you think of your liberation as just what they call in the bookstores, what used to be bookstores, self-help, you've missed the whole story. This isn't just self-help. This is world help. This is the community of Israel. This is the universe. This is planet Earth. This is our morashah, our inheritance of learning about freedom and liberation from the God who wants that. And that is all contained in Exodus chapter 6.
So it is a paradigm for human liberation.
It is.
And is a paradigm not for collective liberation in the story that we're reading, but it's a paradigm, a model for personal liberation, for
Personal and then
whatever
collective.
Egypt you find yourself in.
Right. You had collective slavery, personal liberation, and then collective liberation.
All right, so let me ask you a good rabbi's question. You ready? So lots of people who find themselves stuck. Lots of people who find themselves in whatever Egypt that grabs them and holds them, in whatever addictions or whatever obsessions or whatever compulsions won't let them go, will go to a therapist. And the therapist will take them through a psychological process of finding a better way, of liberating themselves. But you mentioned that in the middle of this, again and again, it's Ani Adonai. It begins with Ani Adonai and it ends with Ani Adonai. So what is the spiritual power that is necessary for human liberation? What is
the spiritual power that's necessary is, and again, the 12-step got it. They got it right. Simple, but correct. Just needs to be unpacked a little. And that is, you can't do it alone. If you think you're stuck, you are stuck. And the reason you're stuck is you're trying to do it alone. And what you need are two things. You need a community of healing. You need to be surrounded by people who are seeking spiritual and physical health. And I want to make sure that isn't overlooked by our listeners, our students. This isn't just spiritual health, it's physical health. One of the issues, truly, when you look at yeshiva kids, they don't look healthy. They don't generally look healthy. They look pale, they look unfit. So partly this is spiritual health, and then it's physical health. But so you need two things. You need community of healing, and you need God, a personal God, who's with you when you walk through the valley of the shadow. He, Atayimadi, you are with me. This notion that we are accompanied by God. We are never alone. We are watched over. So those two things are critical to the liberation we teach. For psychologists, psychotherapists, it's either in medicines, in psychotropic drugs, or it's in the talking cure. But it's not ours. That's not what we brought.
I know, but I want to push you because I want to understand this with more precision. Okay. The community part I get, right? Okay. You need to be with other people who support the process. You have plausibility structures. You need people who will give you strength, and you have in AA, you have a counselor who catches you when you fall and puts you back on the path. That I get. That's beautiful. That's very important. But even psychologists will give you that insight. I want to know what role God plays in the healing of an addict. What role God plays in the healing of a compulsive, what role God plays in what appears to be a psychological process. But you're telling me that there's some role of religion, some role of faith, of religion, of belief, of God in this process. And I want you to specify it.
Yeah, it's two things. It's first of all, God gives us the belief that we are made in the image of God and that we have infinite worth. And that capacity that we have to be liberated and to seek freedom comes from God, because we're made in the image of God, and everyone we encounter is made in the image of God. So when you hurt someone, you are hurting God in the world. And when you love someone, you're loving the image of God in the world. And the second thing, in addition to believing in God that way, is that God takes away our fears. Lo irara, I will not fear evil. I have been told, I didn't do the check in the Gesenius and in the resource text, but I've been told that the most common phrase in the entire Torah is al tira, do not be afraid. So the second thing that we need that is spiritual is that God allays our fears. So first of all, God gives us the foundation to respect all people, including ourselves as made in the image, imago Dei, in Latin. And the second is that God gives us the courage to release our fears because we have nothing to fear. And partly we have nothing to fear when we restore the one jewel in our crown that rabbis and preachers and teachers still refuse to speak about in general. And that's the notion that death is not the end of us. Because the greatest fear, Plato thought it was the reason that we do philosophy is because of the fear of death. But the greatest fear is the fear of death, the fear of human finitude, which is a truth that we are all going to die. But the deeper truth is that the death is our physical death is not the end of our spiritual journey. So those are the reasons, those two big reasons why we need the spiritual life added on to the psychological life and community life. That's it. We are made in the image of God. B'Tselem Elohim barautam, Zacharun keva barautam, male and female, he created them. And the second is lo irara, I will not fear evil. It doesn't mean I won't encounter evil. You will encounter evil. It doesn't mean you aren't going to die. You are going to die. But what it means is you don't have to fear. There's nothing to fear. And, you know, there's that old legend, I think it's from the Christian traditions. I'm not sure where all these legends come from, but a guy dreams every night that he's walking on the beach with God and there's two sets of footprints.
Yeah,
and when he's sick, right, there's only one set. And he said, God, you weren't there. There was just one set of footprints. And God says, yeah, well, when you were in a bad shape, there's one set of footprints because I was carrying you. And that idea that we are not alone, we are made in the image of God and we have nothing to fear is what sustains my faith. And it's the reason I'm a rabbi. It's the reason I'm religious. It's the reason I could see in Tom Hartman that exact sense of spiritual fraternity, that he understood that. And it's why I saw it in the Dalai Lama. And it's why we can't just think that it's only Jews who see this, or even mainly Jews who see this. But that's our destiny. And that's our gift. It's the meaning of chosenness. It's the meaning of our legacy. And here it is all in Exodus chapter 6. It's a story that the text itself says, stop. You're about to read a story which isn't a story. It's a story about your life, your liberation. You are in the story you're about to read, which is impossible, of course, but it's the truth. Not because we were at Sinai. Now we understand that verse. Finally, we understand that verse. It doesn't mean we were at Sinai. That's ridiculous. I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a long way from Sinai. It's not that. It's that the story of Sinai is the story of your liberation.
That's beautiful. Thank you. That was really wonderful. So let's go back over one little piece of this because I want to go back over it again. This is such a precious text. One of the most remarkable midrashim and midrashic traditions about this story we've just read begins with the observation that the deepest part of slavery is not the slavery of the body, but the slavery of the mind, of the soul, of the person. The slave becomes to believe that he is a slave. Yes. That she is a slave, that there's no alternative, and that the slavery becomes so natural to the slave, so natural that they forget that they're slaves. In fact, it's a very subversive idea. It's a very revolutionary idea that you may be a slave and not even know it. You may be a slave and not even know it. I mean, my kids love this movie, The Matrix. You know, you may be living in a made-up world and not even know it. Right. So the question is, and then the two questions is number one. So that the way that the Gera Rebbe, for example, the Sfas Emes tells the story is Moses comes to the people of Israel, And he says, I am Moshe, I've been sent by God to liberate you. And their answer is, from what? And he says, what do you mean from what? You're slaves. And they say, no, we're not. We are, servants of the Pharaoh. This is who and what we are. And they can't imagine anything different. And they have so assimilated their own slavery that they have so accommodated themselves to it that they can't imagine. They don't even perceive the humiliation, the oppression, the pain. It becomes part of the normal to them. It becomes part of the normal, right? There's several movies that come out in the last several years about the civil rights movement. One of the most astonishing ones is this wonderful movie called The Help. And it's about African-American Black women who were maids, family maids in the American South in the 60s, 50s and the 60s. Jessica Chastain plays a young woman who was raised by this woman, and she comes back from college and discovers that the family's fired her. And she goes on a sort of campaign as a journalist to try to find the stories of these women. And the idea that they had become so accustomed, so accommodated to their station in life. And as you said, afraid to imagine anything different, because whatever pain you're in, it's what you know. And what you don't know is always going to be more frightening than what you know. And so the question that Moshe has to do is, how do you lift them up? So the Gerer, the Sfas Emes, has this wonderful image where he says they look at him, Moshe. So we talked about last week about how he knows he's Jewish. They look at him and he looks like them and he talks like them, but he's not like them. And they begin to calculate, why isn't he like us? And that's where they realize his freedom as opposed to their freedom. And that's when they begin to understand their own slavery. And so this revelation, this spiritual opening up, is a question of discovering who I am and what I am, and then beginning to be able to imagine I could be different. And then the most important thing is what you said, that I deserve to be different, that I deserve better, that there's a worthiness to me, that I'm not willing to give up my own dignity. I'm not willing to continue to accept the humiliation as my identity, but I can imagine an identity that's more exalted than the one I find myself in. And that is remarkable. I'm worth saving. I deserve better. I'm worth being loved. And then the idea of a God who loves you enough to liberate you, to bring you out. That's what this chapter is. This is the tale of the psychological liberation of the people of Israel, but it's the tale of, as you said, the spiritual liberation of anybody.
Yes. Beautiful, Ed. Beautiful.
Yeah.
And we are worth it. Why are we worth it? Because we're made in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
We're not dirt. We're not nothing. We're not slaves. We're not maids. We're made in the image of God. And I think when you look back at the antebellum South and you look at how the Black community was able to preserve any sense of dignity and self-worth, it was the church, the Black church, where they would go there and they would be told, no matter what, you are God's children. You are beloved.
You are somebody.
Yes.
You are somebody. And a preacher who stands in front of you and says, I have a dream, which means that my current reality does not exhaust all of being, all of reality, but I have a dream. I have an imagination of what could be.
Right.
That's a very subversive idea. That's a remarkably revolutionary and powerful idea.
And look, the Torah is so sophisticated that if you look beyond the Torah to the Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible, and then you look beyond that to the Christian Testament, you see what happens to people who say that to people, who bring the message of liberation, like King or Jesus, or they're killed, and they may be killed, but the message can't be killed. And the people are exiled from the land, but there's the messianic hope we'll be returned to the land. Whether we are or aren't, it's not the point. The point is we're given hope. We're always given hope. And, when I listen to young rabbis who send me their sermons, first thing I'm looking at is, is there hope there? Is there hopefulness in the sermon? You know, you and I were trained by preachers who said, you know, I always have to end with a nechemta, end with something upbeat. Well, why is that? The whole thing should be upbeat, even in dark times, even in difficult times. But the kvetch sermon, the kvetching, the feeling that this guy's bad, the polarization of our culture, this has had, we talk about the political implications of a bifurcated America. That's bad. The political implications are terrible, but they aren't even the worst implications. And they aren't even the worst consequences. The worst consequences is that people are no longer talking about hope. They're talking about despair and anger and division. But how can there be division if we're all made in the image of God? If right-wing Republicans can say that, you know, the left-wing Democrats are made in the image of God. If left-wing Democrats can say right-wing Republicans are made in the image of God. If Jews and Christians, if oh, dear God, there's all these possibilities for liberation, and all of them depend on spiritual liberation. And when you look at all the great leaders and prophets, they're all religious. If you look at Gandhi and King and the Dalai Lama, they're all religious. They all get this. And if you look at the people who are killing the culture, who have killed the world, of Stalin and Pol Pot and Hitler, you look at them and they're all anti-religious. Mm. This isn't a coincidence. And the point I'm making is this lesson is not, oh, and you do this and blah, 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 and Walt Disney and the prince comes and kisses Snow White and da-da-da-da, and they live happily ever after. No, because the world is full of fear and despair and slavery. And the reason why this move to personal liberation is put into the Torah is because it's the only way that history changes. History changes when people no longer accept themselves in the beautiful way you describe as worth nothing and as natural slaves. That, and in the best writings of Marx, that's what's in it. You know, so all I can say is I'm proud to inherit this, and I'm proud to teach it, and I'm proud that the Torah has it in there. And I'm proud that despite all the other things Jews don't do, they have seders, and most of them read this little passage of Exodus 6. And it's to me, it's like you have a seder with a diamond in the middle of the table, and no one talks about the diamond.
Right.
So, you know, there it is.
So here's your homework, everyone. You've heard a beautiful, beautiful talk from this morning from Rabbi Gellman, from his heart. I want you to take a moment this morning, or this Shabbos, and open up your Chumash, open up a Torah, and read Exodus 6, but read it slowly, and read it in the first person. Don't read it as a story that happened a long time ago to people far, far away. Read it to us. It's our story, right? Put the word me in there, right? God has promised to take me, to liberate me. Read it in the first person and understand that this is not, that this is a paradigm. This is a paradigm for human history and for the liberation of the human spirit. Marc, thank you this morning. There's a beautiful, beautiful Torah this morning. Thank you so very much. And to everyone, a very, very good Shabbos. Stay well, stay warm, stay careful, be careful. And we wish everybody a very, very, very sweet Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, my friend.